About 8 days after Jesus said these things, he took Peter, James, and John and went up on a mountain to pray. And as he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes like white lightning flashed. 2 men, Moses and Elijah, were talking with him, and they were clothed with heavenly splendor, and spoke about Jesus' departure, which he would achieve in Jerusalem. Peter and those with him were almost overcome by sleep, but they managed to stay awake and saw his glory as well as the 2 men with him. As the 2 men were about to leave Peter said to them, "Master, it's good that we're here. We should construct 3 shrines, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." But he didn't know what he was saying. Peter was still speaking, and a cloud overshadowed them. As they entered the cloud, they were overcome with awe. And then a voice from the cloud said, "This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him." Even as the voice spoke, Jesus was found alone. They were speechless, and at the time told no one what they had seen. The next day, when Jesus, Peter, and John, and James had come down from the mountain, a large crowd met Jesus. A man from the crowd shouted, "Teacher, I beg you to take a look at my son, my only child. Look, a spirit seizes him, and without any warning, he screams. It shakes him and causes him to foam at the mouth. It tortures him and rarely leaves him alone. I beg your disciples to throw it out, but they couldn't do it." Jesus replied, "You faithless and crooked generation, how long will I be with you and put up with you? Bring your son here." While he was coming, the demon threw him down and shook him violently, and Jesus spoke harshly to the unclean spirit, healed the child, and gave him back to his father. And everyone was overwhelmed by God's greatness. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So here's the deal. It's kind of strange. In reading and researching this week's passage, I actually ended up writing 2 completely different sermons. Some weeks, I got to be honest, it's a struggle. Other weeks it flows. Another factor this week is we have so much stuff happening. There was a meeting about Christian education. The elder communion. I knew the sermon this week would be much shorter, but I just was so inspired. I wrote 2 completely different sermons on 2 completely different parts of this passage. You see, this season of Epiphany, I think I was inspired to do this because Epiphany has been really special for me, and I got a little bit carried away. You know, the church, we have our high holy days, the obvious ones, and our high holy seasons. We're about to enter one. Lent, ultimately the culmination of Easter. We have Advent, which culminates at Christmas. But Epiphany, which its high holy days are Epiphany, the baptismal of the Lord, and today, the last day of Epiphany, the Transfiguration Sunday, as we call it. They don't rank quite as high as the other ones, right? They fall somewhere in the spectrum just behind Pentecost and definitely before the St. Clement Day. Have you ever heard of that one? St. Clement's Day? Oh, it's a great one. I would actually encourage us as a church to bring back this tradition. It is wonderful. It happens on November 23rd every year, so mark it down. We got plenty of time to prepare. It begins with the ceremonial firing of the anvil. And why? Because it remembers St. Clement I, a pope, who is the patron saint of blacksmiths. And this is his feast day. It's the ceremonial firing of the anvil, which sounds kind of innocent enough, but here's what it is. There's holes in the anvil, and they fill it with gunpowder, and the blacksmiths run up with hammers and hit it, hoping to not be the one that sparks the gunpowder and catches themselves on fire. So let's do it, church. But there's more. It gets better than that. They have the night filled with drinking and singing, but the night is capped off with this special thing where the blacksmiths of the village dress up as, they call it, Old Clem. That's the character, St. Clement. They dress up as him, and they go door to door with other members of the town, and they pound on the doors, and they ask and they beg for fruits, nuts, money, and beer. Let's get planted on that. That is a holiday. Well, I think I wrote 2 whole sermons about Epiphany because this Epiphany season is really long compared to previous years. Last year, Ash Wednesday fell on February 14th, but this year, Ash Wednesday this week, 3 whole weeks later. And not only is this season abnormally long, on a personal level, we're in year C of the liturgical calendar, which means we're spending a lot of time in the Gospel of Luke, which is my favorite gospel. It's a gospel that actually has 2 parts, Luke and Acts. It's the larger story. It's written by someone we assume is a doctor because he uses medical language, and he uses language that he's been there in parts of this journey. So this morning, I'm going to give you a choice. Do you want to hear the sermon that's about verses 28 through 36, which is Jesus and Peter and James and John on the mountain? It's Transfiguration Sunday. It's the story of Transfiguration. Or do you want to hear the sermon about the second half of today's passage where Jesus heals the boy? So what's it going to be? Transfiguration or the demon-possessed boy? Let's just do a show of hands. How many want to hear Transfiguration? Okay. How many of you want to hear the second part, the demon-possessed boy? All right, so I'm going to make an executive decision, and I'm going to say Transfiguration by a hair. And that's because I'm going to include my vote, because that's the better sermon, frankly. So give me a second. All right. For weeks and weeks, if you remember, we've been following this Jesus around. And we feel like we're getting close to understanding him the way the apostles, the disciples were getting close. We feel like we're on the outskirts of this full revelation of who he is. There's certainly been a lot of evidence to indicate who Jesus is to this point. Jesus, he might be the actual Messiah, the long-awaited king, the shoot that comes up from the stump of Jesse. If you remember in Luke's gospel, we've seen the star over the manger. We've seen the dove descend over Jesus at his baptism. We've seen him turn water into wine. We've heard that prophetic message of salvation and hope to that ragtag mess of people, that crowd that's following him around. But in today's passage, we hear the actual word, the actual voice of God. There's no more question about it. There's no more hinting around. This scene is so wild, it's obvious. Peter, James, and John, they go up the mountain. And what do we associate high places with? A connection with God. That's something that just seems to be built into our DNA. I don't know what it is about them. Because even with our understanding of the cosmos and interplanetary movements, we can't help but think that being higher means being closer to God, because God's right up there, right? We think that, but if we're all honest about interplanetary movements and the cosmos, we realize there's no such thing as up there. There's no up or down. It's just a direction. We don't necessarily literally think God is up there because we don't share the cosmos that the ancients believed in, where they believed there was a dome of glass holding back the seas of chaos, and heaven was back there behind that. No, but still we associate height, highness, and holiness. They seem to correlate in our minds. And so Jesus goes up to this high place with the select group of disciples. What does that sound like? It sounds like that later story when Jesus goes to the Garden of Gethsemane with these same small group of disciples to pray before his arrest and execution. There is so much stuff happening here. I can't imagine Luke, with all of his rich detail, actually was able to write it all down. Luke says Jesus' face and clothes are glowing like Moses, when Moses came down from Sinai, his face and his clothes glowed. And Moses and Elijah appeared. They're the 2 titans of the Jewish faith. Moses, he's this figure that reminds us of the past. He reminds us of God liberating Israel from the bondage of Egypt. He reminds us of this new nation forged in the wilderness. He reminds us of this law that's written in stone, this law that's the cornerstone of Israel. He is Israel's past. And then there's Elijah. If Moses is the past, Elijah is the future. He's the end times. He's the prophet that is calling people back to God. In the minds of the people of Israel, Elijah was associated with end times. And so they're standing in their, frankly, fabulous outfits where they would win every red carpet award. They all have these beautiful glowing robes. They're talking. And Jesus is talking about this departure, going to Jerusalem for this departure. And this is where our translations fail us. If we were to translate that actual word there correctly, the word he is using is Exodus. Evocative language. His Exodus he's going to do in Jerusalem. Israel's past and Israel's future is standing there talking to Israel's present about a new Exodus. And somehow the story gets wilder. Peter and the boys, somehow they are managing to almost fall asleep during this, but they wake up a little bit and they observe this. I don't know how this is possible to fall asleep with this light show and craziness happening, but they wake up and they see it. They see it, and what's their reaction? They want to build these little huts, these booths, these yurts there for them to stay. It reminds us of the festival of the tabernacles, the festival of booths. This Jewish tradition where people would travel from all over Israel to Jerusalem sometime in the fall to celebrate and remember in this ritualistic way when they were lost in the wilderness, just around the tabernacle. And so they would build these temporary dwellings to stay there for weeks for this festival. It's like an overload of symbolism. It's like eating too rich food. It's just too much. And in that's when we hear it, the voice of God. This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him. There are no more questions. No one there close to Jesus is wondering anymore. He now is the Messiah. They saw him teach with power. They saw him heal with power. They heard him say that he had come to set free the captives, but now they know he is Emmanuel. He is God with us. It's on the mountaintop where these disciples saw and fully understood and fully grasped that reality of who Jesus is. Have you ever had a mountaintop experience? Maybe not one where you've seen Jesus, Moses, and Elijah, but have you had a mountaintop experience? Scan your memories. What are the moments that stick out to you? Have you had a moment where God felt uniquely real and so close that it transformed the way you saw the world? Maybe it transformed the way you saw yourself, forever changing you, transfiguring your faith. I want so desperately for you to have those moments, to have that experience, to have your lives transfigured by an encounter with Jesus in that type of way, a way that you fully can't explain with words. That's why I want you to consider going on things like our mission trip, where we go to visit brothers and sisters in Syria and Lebanon across the world, because I believe in trips like that hold the possibility for mountaintop transfiguring experiences. That's why I want us to engage with members of our community in service and in love, because I believe God can transfigure our faith in those moments and give us mountaintop experiences. Because when we're in those moments, it's like we're released from our fears. We're released from our pessimistic expectations of what is possible in our lives, in our church, in this world. It helps us realize that even though we don't see it, the power of the transfigured Jesus is still at work in this world, just waiting to burst through. There is more power and more hope and more love. There are more possibilities than we could ever imagine. And when we are on the mountaintop with Jesus, it's as though we can see them. We need those experiences to help us take that quantum leap of faith. The leap into faith that doesn't make sense to us because there's no amount of reasoning that's going to get me to that point. I cannot will myself to that place. I cannot fake it till I make it in that place. There's no level of my own strength that can bring me to the place where my faith is transfigured on the mountaintop. That's why we say faith is a gift. It's not earned, it's not forced, it is a gift given to you by God. And it's often on the top of a mountain, either literally or figuratively, that we receive that gift of faith. In our society, we really value ecstatic experiences. All of us suffer to some degree of FOMO. Have you ever heard that? The fear of missing out. You see other people doing amazing things, and you're like, I want that. I want to experience that thing where, whether it's religious or not, you're moved. We have this fear of missing out, and I think that affects us as Christians and when we observe the faith of others as well. It's hard not to see the experience of faith of others and compare it to ourselves and wonder, why am I not experiencing God in that way? Why does it seem that these other people live on the mountaintop, yet I'm here in the valley? When we think about those moments, I don't know what they look like for you. I remember in my life as a teenager attending a worship conference and feeling connected to God in a moment of worship where I'm singing songs with my brothers and sisters, and I feel the powerful presence in that. Maybe that's you. Maybe it's when you're hiking alone. Maybe it's when you're cooking a meal with friends. Maybe it's when you're reading a story to your child at bedtime. Maybe it's just in a moment where you can actually find yourself fully still. I don't know what it is for you, but I want that for you. Where Christ meets you and changes your faith and moves you forward in ways that you just didn't think were possible. But here's the issue when we have that fear of missing out, or when we see others and we're jealous of their mountaintop experiences. It makes the mistake of assuming that life is meant to be lived on the mountaintop. It's the place where we encounter and we visit Jesus in a unique and transfiguring way, but we don't and we cannot stay there. Peter and James and John had such a powerful and a compelling experience. They wanted to have the Festival of Booths up there, to stay there weeks. They wanted to literally build places to stay and dwell there because it's this blessed, sacred space. My friends, you're not called to live on top of the mountain. So even though you chose the first sermon about the Transfiguration, it can't just be a sermon about just that. Because the mountain and the valley are intimately intertwined. One cannot experience the goodness of God without seeking to heal and to liberate others. The glory of God's presence and the pain of a broken world cannot be separated. In Luke's passage that I read today, it says the very next day. They didn't even stay there 24 hours. The very next day, the disciples come down and they immediately have a crowd waiting for them, engaging them. That's why I love the great Italian painter Raphael's depiction of the Transfiguration. Go look it up. I actually had it, but I'm not able to pull it up here. It's this beautiful painting that has the Transfiguration on the top, but the second story at the bottom, it has the Father, the weeping Father, holding the Son who's in the middle of a seizure there with the crowd surrounded. You cannot separate those things. That's the genius of this lectionary selection. They are shoved together. They are not separated. Sisters and brothers, our lives are lived in the valleys. They are lived in the towns. They are lived in the cities, the projects, the villages, the suburbs. Life is lived in plains and foothills and coastlines. And while we may venture up the mountain and love it up there because we are moved and changed and our faith is deepened and reoriented, we are ultimately sent back from the mountain down to the brokenness to share what we've learned, to share from the abundance that we've received. So it is my prayer for you today that you may find yourself on a mountain peak with Jesus. That you see in him your past, your present, your future. that you may be captivated by this new exodus Jesus is leading to bring us back to God. And may you feel the call to descend that mountain, knowing that you cannot live there. Descend that mountain to head back into the neighborhoods and the communities where God is calling us to love and serve and share His good news. This is my prayer for you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.